In order to understand sovereignty, you had to have the historical background of the development of the United States in connection with Indian governance and Indian lands within the United States. So then we developed the tribal history component to go with it. I think sovereignty itself is very simple to define, and that's that you have absolute control over the people and land within your recognized territory. That, in its simplest form, that applies to every sovereign. Where it becomes difficult for Indian issues is that that land base has been eroded through a variety of governmental actions, and how the courts have viewed that erosion has impacted that sovereignty. And then there's also the impact of the limits that have been placed on who they can exercise jurisdiction by the federal courts. So you have these federal factors coming in affecting tribal sovereignty. Unless you sort of understand the tribal cultural aspect of it, you're going to run into barriers that you don't even know why there's a barrier there, but you're going to get resistance. And the student that took the lead on this is a non-Indian student. And I always laugh because she come to me and she said, I think I had a white moment. Should something happen, I don't know what happened, but something happened. And so then she'd go through and tell me what happened. And often it would be certainly a cultural issue, that something had come up that, in this case, it was on treaty rights, that a comment had been made about, well, but those don't exist anymore. And the Indians in the group certainly shut down immediately when that did. So I think there are those things that are being said that they don't even realize that there's bias in them, or that it is reflective of their lack of what sovereignty means, and that tribes are the First Nations here, and they are the oldest sovereigns here, and they're the oldest forms of government in the United States. And so it's that lack, sort of almost of, it's not necessarily disrespect, but that lack of appreciation for tribal governance that is going to create barriers, I think. The most common thing that they say is, well, they lost the war, so they don't have any rights. This is their implication there, where in fact, most of the land was exchanged through treaties. So it wasn't a matter of that there was some battle and those were the spoils of battle. It was a matter that they negotiated, and I use that term loosely, with tribes for an exchange of lands, and exchange for things like education, health care, water, farming components, and they retained certain rights of a sovereign. And the fact that they retain those rights, I think, is missing. And it's not just from high school teachers. I will tell you that the Supreme Court has difficulty with those concepts as well. My new passion is Indian education for all as a way of actually affecting change. Going through the court system has not been successful, and in fact it's been very detrimental in recent years, but I keep thinking if we had the Supreme Court justices who had got this in high school and understand the concepts of sovereignty, we would have very different decisions being rendered by the Supreme Court in the Indian law area, because they would have that grasp. One of the things that Kim McKelvey, the student that primarily worked on that, is the Helena, and I can't tell you which Helena public school, the high school, had asked for somebody to come, and Kim went over with a more abbreviated version of the 2 PowerPoints, sovereignty PowerPoints. And she said it was so interesting, because at first they were like, well, wait a minute, like they shouldn't have any of those rights. And she said at the beginning when she started this, and by the end they were like, well, now wait a minute, is this a Stevens Treaty or a Fort Laramie Treaty? So she said just in that hour time, the transformation of recognizing why the decisions are made like they are, and where there are difficulties in sort of, I guess, combining those two different results when you look at the treaty language. So I think they grasp how difficult it is for tribes to sort of grasp or understand what limits have been imposed on them, and where there's going to be difficulties in exercising those treaty rights. Because I live up on Flathead on the reservation, and my kids had gone to the RLE school system up there, and so I would go to their classes and do the tribal governance from the time they were about in 3rd grade on. And I'd always say, okay, we're going to talk about the oldest government in the United States. What do you think it is? And they say, oh, it's a city, da, 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 da. And, they never get to the tribe the first year. And by the time I got to the third year of doing this in a row, I'd say, okay, we're going to talk about the oldest government. What is it? And they were like, it's the tribal government. So I think you can have that kind of an impact. I think that's an example of, if you give the kids that information, they're going to retain it. And it's a matter of building on it. And if you start in first grade to where you have information for the students that it's a third form of government. So when they look at their books, it's not just the states and the federal government, it's the states, the federal government, and the tribes are all listed there under the sovereignty or the sovereign powers in the United States. And I think that would be a huge difference for tribes. I had a student in my tribal course, tribal law class. This is their third year of law school. We're doing this whole history, the broken treaties, the land takings issue, and she stops me finally and said, how come this is the first time I'm hearing about any of this? She said, I went to undergraduate here in Montana, I went to high school in Montana, I went to grade school in Montana. How come I've never heard of any of this before? And she's absolutely right. You should not be in your last year of law school before you hear about any of this. This real strong push for Indian education for all is incredibly beneficial, and I just cannot thank the framers of the Montana Constitution enough for having that foresight to include that in there. I think it is such a unique and important provision that it should be in the U.S. Constitution because the impact is so great that they're just missing a whole segment of sovereignty in the United States without that kind of background.